got this wide array of bots which are available to threat actors to go up against a retailer. And one of my favorite questions is, why would you use a bot against a £20 billion retailer? Well, it's the £20 billion, which is probably the answer to that. And then also the interesting way in which you can use bots against a retailer to either disrupt a sale, interfere with the ordering process, or actually just go for business intelligence stuff where you are scraping all the product information, all the pricing information, and then using that and selling it as a competitive service. So bots are a significant issue for retailers. They're a significant risk, and they've actually become far more prevalent. There is no single piece of technology that I've found that deals with the bots in totality. And where you end up is going to that classic multi-layered approach to try and detect, observe, and then mitigate each of the bots depending on what they're trying to do to you as a retailer. The other thing you need to maybe think about when you're reviewing your security controls for bots is that there's a commercial aspect that you need to think about. In some countries, the regulators are pushing retailers to put in multi-factor authentication. Every time you try to you disrupt a customer retail journey, you are likely going to have to explain why you're reducing the perceived customer sign-up rate, and you're also going to have to explain why the conversion rate may have dropped. Sometimes these bots are actually buying your products and reselling them for you. You do need to be a little bit more detailed in your risk assessment when you're going through how you go take on bots. So other than ransomware, bots are probably a really entertaining area to look at if you work at a retailer. Okay. Second thing is robots, and I've kind of abused the term robots here. So when it's dark and the lights go out in some stores around the world, you can actually see robots start to emerge from the back office and actually start doing in-store stock replenishment. There's no longer those colleagues who are having to go around and do that themselves. You can actually automate all this sort of stuff. Within a store, you're seeing them transform from that plain old experience into a highly digital, integrated, personalized experience, which means that you've got machine learning in place. AI is maybe overused. You've got IoT in place. You've got data protection issues. You've got data processing things to think through. You've got a far more complicated in-store network to think about. You've probably got a multitude of suppliers of varying degrees of competency when it comes to cybersecurity that you need to think through. So again, if you're approaching this from a risk perspective, then you need to think through how you're approaching the traditional stores, which are certainly moving on from that traditional approach. The other area where robots and automation are prevalent and have introduced both opportunities for retailers, but cybersecurity risks are the warehouses. So I mentioned previously the giga warehouses. These are the things that if you fly into Atlanta, you'll see two enormous white buildings. They are both large warehouses serving that side or that central area of the USA. Within those warehouses, you have bots carrying stock from the trucks into the bins, moving the bins into the right location, getting them ready for packing and picking, taking them down for quality control, putting them in the package, labeling them, taking them out to the courier, and then it's off into the courier service. Some of the more modern warehouses are entirely dependent on automation. That automation can be delivered inside that giga warehouse in a number of ways. It can be installed on site. So you need to think through, again, your network security, your segmentation, your DR and business continuity. In some warehouses, it's actually being done as a service. You might want to think through carefully the implications of that. It is probably cheaper for you as a retailer, but when that supplier goes down, then all your warehouses go with it as well. And these warehouses are so large and manipulating and managing so much stock that these days you can maybe lose one and cover up those losses by redirecting output from the other warehouses. If you lose two, then customers will notice the failed orders, the declined orders, the low availability from the e-com site. all of those issues start to proliferate, and eventually they'll slow your retail operations down to a halt. This is something that is not getting the attention it deserves within retail, and it's something that I know that some of colleagues are particularly focused on. So yeah, so that whole efficiency, convenience, automation, both in store and in warehouse, are maybe retail specific issues that don't get enough discussion. Now we'll move on to the global aspects, and this is purely skewed on my own experiences, and the things that I'd like to maybe highlight to this audience are how compliance changes around the world. The UK view is very good, but it's not the only one on the planet. And some of the things that you come across are quite interesting. So we obviously have GDPR and DPA, which I imagine everyone on this call is familiar with. You then go to maybe something like in South Korea, the IT audit. It's very prescriptive, it's very audit-led, and it comes with a couple of million, well, just under $1 million in fines. Then you have things like the Personal Information Protection Law, the Multi-Level Protection Scheme 2.0, and the Cross-Border Data Transfer laws and regulations in China. And that's actually quite an interesting set of regulations to look at. It's well organized, it's well structured, it's been introduced in a gradual manner, and the totality of it will then ultimately lead to every retailer and every supplier being much more respectful of China's citizens' data, but also all those Chinese technology companies. Their security is also being dramatically improved as retailers enforce these new standards and regulations. You end up with about 135 to 137 different regulations to trade and comply with these laws in the People's Republic of China. And they're definitely, if you haven't looked at them, they're definitely worthwhile looking at. They've got some very well-structured approaches to things. They also come with quite a heavy incentive. It's probably something like a $7 million fine for the first infringement. After that, you might actually have your license to do business within China revoked, which is not good for any organization, and it certainly gets the attention of a retailer. I think maybe the US is obviously very well known. You've got their new approach that the SEC have put in. So they've started to change the mandate for boards and highlight that cybersecurity experience is required at the board level. We've also had the unfortunate case with the former CISO of Uber getting a 3-year jail sentence. So there's some implications there for you as a CISO on when to protect your own interests and follow your belief in what the law states versus what your company general counsel might be saying. So that's an interesting dynamic, which is currently unique to the States. And then you've got the wide variety of notification procedures that you have to do for each state. And then some states have their own cybersecurity related compliance requirements. And then the last point on this slide, which I found useful, is that in major markets, sometimes the regulator is up to like a pre-negotiation. Technically, you might be required to notify the regulator of every single instance that an account is credential stuffed. It's where a username and the sequence of passwords are tested against the account until they get a valid response. You may be, if you're well structured in your approach, may be able to negotiate a position which is written down where you don't have to notify regulators. That's sometimes something you might want to consider to alleviate the tension between you and the local regulator, and then also allow both you and the regulator and the local law enforcement to focus on items related to cybercrime, which I'll come on to later on. So from a global perspective, there is quite a diversion in the way that compliance has been done. And I think EU, UK is definitely in one place. Some other regions are going in a different place, and it's very interesting to compare and contrast those because you have to be prepared for it. You then have to repeat that for all your payment instruments, where I'm not just talking about credit cards and debit cards. As a retailer, you'll have probably put in some sort of alternative payment methods. You might also have buy now, pay later, which brings its whole host of issues, particularly when they try to do notifications to get debt back and stuff like that. And I've touched on it before, but if you're ever in the unfortunate situation to actually do a proper breach notification, it suddenly becomes very complicated when you dig into that particular country and realise that they don't follow the rules that anyone else follows, and they have a completely different procedure which requires passport photographs and details of board members, all the way down to multiple copies of the text in 3 different variants of the local dialect. Okay, so if you're thinking through your global retail operations, this is something that you probably want to think through. So I'm racing through this because we are running out of time. Conflict, unfortunately, is a global topic that appears to be increasing rather than decreasing. I'm not going to comment on recent events. I'm going to talk about things from a sort of more abstract level, and maybe some of the things that I've learned from in the past. So it might be a bit strange that for a retailer, the first point where you start from your risk assessment might be threat to life. And it's not a dramatic statement, it's a genuine statement. And you might have instances in a warehouse where automation is hacked or taken control of, and that can make machinery operate in a very strange way that can result in a threat to a human being or a colleague, which needs to be taken seriously. It is amazing the number of risk assessments I've seen at retailers that don't consider any aspect of this. The other items which are related to threat to life are cybersecurity, cyberbullying, which can ultimately lead to very tragic outcomes. Again, when I review cybersecurity risk assessments and mitigations, it's surprisingly common to find that that aspect has not been thought through, and the technical and commercial aspects have. So that's something I'd like to highlight to this group that you might want to consider when you do this stuff in either now or in the future. Obviously, with the conflicts that I've been talking about, that then raises good crisis management. And one of the best things that I was introduced to by a director of communications was a PR company in the UK, ex-BBC and ITN journalists, and they had this amazing process where they made every cybersecurity professional, every well-trained communications director, every calm and collected CFO, and every super dynamic, enthusiastic CEO suddenly realised they didn't know how to answer a journalist's comment when a TV crew turn up and doorstep them. It is surprising how weak crisis management can be, and particularly within retailers, quite good at dealing with internal crisis, not that awesome at dealing with anything that goes outside of that. So that's an area of maturity within retailers, which takes you on to disaster recovery. And then maybe an interesting topic is sanctions. So we've seen a dramatic increase in sanctions out of the UK, the EU, the US, and then sometimes they're reciprocated from other regions. If you're a retailer, you don't want to be embroiled in any of this, but you need to be knowledgeable and aware of the sanctions. Something that is proving to be particularly tricky is when you look through your technology supply chain, you need to be very careful in understanding any connections to sanctioned individuals or organizations. It's not necessarily that obvious. And in some cases, it's better to get third-party legal support to actually support with that. Again, it depends on your scale as a retailer if you have to deal with this sort of stuff, but it is increasingly complicated. Now we move on to a favourite topic of mine, cybercrime, and I'm using cybercrime to cover a multitude of sins. If you go to the Crown Prosecution Service, they actually have a really nice guide on cyber-related prosecution and the definitions, and they have cyber-dependent and cyber-enabled. I'll let you go and Google that, but it's actually, if you're not familiar with it, it's a very worthwhile read. The areas that I've kind of pulled out from a retailer's perspective, online payment fraud, I think that's kind of self-explanatory. With the boom in e-commerce, you've had the boom on online payment fraud, and the lack of preparation, the lack of machine learning-based fraud platforms, and sometimes the complete absence of fraud teams, which is true and surprising at some retailers. You've then got the secondary impacts. You've got the returns fraud. I think my favourite example is a 5-foot stuffed giraffe that was returned instead of a jumper. It seems like an awful lot of effort, but it was a really good jumper, which they didn't want to return, but they wanted a refund for it. So there's these sort of dynamics. And the reason I've brought these highlighted these is that there's a strong connection between cybersecurity and its ability to analyze and find the relevant data and then to track patterns and behaviors and your fraud team. And this is where more often than not, I'm seeing fraud teams and cybersecurity teams starting to come together. And in fact, H&M, we've recently created a cybercrime unit, which we're now building out to get a better level of focus on these sort of things. The fourth item down the list is payment diversion fraud. It's sometimes, I've heard it referred to as accounts payable fraud, and the example would be a supplier is compromised, their email, you have access to the supplier's email, you have access to the history of conversations with the retailer's accounts payable team. You eventually lead that through a social engineering exercise to get those bank details changed, and then you can very quickly see millions of pounds, millions of dollars being diverted out of the legitimate account and off somewhere else. I've been fortunate enough to be worked with really good fraud teams, really good physical security teams, and really good banks, where the banks have actually noticed that strange behaviour and helped the retailer stop that. I could be wrong, but I think the FBI are putting a $2.7 billion value on PDF right now, which actually makes it bigger than ransomware payments. So if you're a retailer, you end up paying quite a lot of time and attention to payment diversion fraud. And just using that classical control of dual sign-off isn't enough for this. You need to have more rigorous processes, more rigorous monitoring, and you need to make sure that you understand how your suppliers are communicating bank account changes. So that's an entertaining one for retailers. And then organised crime. It's not like it is on TV. These are serious groups of 30 or more individuals, well organised. They have a plan. In some cases, they actually know your systems better than you do. They actually have better training material than you do. You might find them inside warehouses where they know how to manipulate not just the internal stock, but actually they understand how to get into the IT systems and make entire product lines or product deliveries just disappear. And that is a traceability and accountancy nightmare. But you're up against organised crime, so you might find one group and you remove them, and then within 3 months, if you haven't improved your security controls, you're going to have that group back in there. And during COVID, there was quite a big shift from physical organised crime to then going into cyber crime. Now it's going back into the warehouses, the logistics, and even trying to get into stores at some other retailers. Again, it's not something you might think about if you're a retail organisation or you supply security services to a retail organisation, but this is quite a big deal. A great example, or the evidence to back that statement up, is that the insurers, the logistics companies and the retailers in the UK have almost formed their own body where they share data on how often their trucks are emptied, where they're emptied, how they're emptied, and any related criminal proceedings. So again, there's something that might not be on the surface when you think about retail. The connection with cybersecurity is that cybersecurity is probably best placed to be the instrument which finds the data, joins the connections, joins the dots, and then also puts together the really well-structured E111 evidence form for the local police who, in the UK at least, are very good at following this stuff through. And then you're also backed up by potentially the National Crime Agency in the UK who look after, try to address some of the organised crime. But more often than not, it's probably at the scale where a local law enforcement or a local police force can deal with it. Yeah. So now we're kind of getting into the end of the presentation, and my long monologue will stop. And then I'll try and see whatever questions are there because I can't see the chat. So we talk about the organisation. This is not specifically retail. This is not specific to retail. you could, if you're starting out as a CISO, you might want to think about this sort of stuff. Or if you're looking to refresh an organization, or you want to put in a more structured approach, which is easier to defend when you go to your budget discussions or your audit committees, then this is an approach which I've found that works. So I've used the CIISec roles and skills framework. I've rewritten all the roles in an organization to map onto that. And then the roles have competency levels, and then you have the roles, and the competency levels then have a collection of skills. That gives you a very structured approach, which is easy to defend against auditors. Not that you should be defending yourself against auditors. You should be assisting the auditor. I think that's the correct way of saying that. But also it shows that you've actually got the best coverage, that you've actually thought through as much of the landscape as possible, and that from a career perspective, which I'll touch on later, you're actually probably introducing a good approach. The other way, or the other thing that you might want to do if you're restructuring this, your organization, is to think in terms of services which you deliver. And you can break cybersecurity into about 7 or 8 units. And then within each of those units, you can talk about the services that each of those units provide. So I've typically found that a cybersecurity area will deliver 32 services. And the reason I'm talking about services is if you're working at a modern retailer, you will probably have a product, services, and applications catalog which governs everything that the technology function provides. You can try and stay separate to that and talk about cybersecurity on its own, which it might feel quite nice. It's sometimes better to be integrated into that holistic set, so that when you have a product team and that product team is developing a new IT product or service, and they're looking through that catalog of what they need to pull down on, they will see that actually they have the business continuity management service from cybersecurity. They have the IT and cyber risk management service they need to plug into. They have the DR service, all this sort of stuff. You can pull down on that. And then you can also use this to explain to your audit committee how you've structured your organization, how you have each of these services, how they're being utilized, and how you can improve the maturity of those over a matter of time. Again, that goes back to how you're managing your stakeholders as a CISO, and how you're explaining the investment into your organization versus the benefit to the wider organization. So that combination of using the CIISec framework and then breaking it into services has turned out to be quite a powerful and useful mechanism for structuring your organization. And you might theoretically end up with something grouped like this. The order and where people or units are placed on this is not important. Governance, risk and compliance, cybersecurity, culture and competence, security operations, cybersecurity advisors. That's your interface to your technology teams, to your product teams, to your service teams, that sort of stuff. Cybersecurity architecture, keep it close to your heart. Security engineering, which is typically going to be looking after identity. It could even, some retailers will look after customer identity as well as enterprise identity, and it will be looking after all the security controls and configurations. And then security portfolio management, which is only relevant if you're working at a larger organization and you've got multiple initiatives going across the entire organization, which could be global, could be regional. That needs a bit of oversight and continuous management. The reason I put a star against cybersecurity culture and competence is that when you look at the current CIISec framework, it's actually a bit weak on that area, which I think maybe our membership should try and maybe offer some ways of improving that, because changing the cybersecurity behaviors of 170,000 people is not an easy task, and it has to be done in a structured, meaningful manner, which delivers a net benefit to the organization. And there's behavioral triggers, there's phishing simulations, there's a whole load of stuff inside that culture box, which probably needs a bit more thought and dedication to. And then within operations, the reasons I've kind of highlighted that is you will have your security operations, you have your SIEM, your SOC, your SOAR, and then you have your attack surface reduction. And if you go back to that very early diagram of what retail is, you can see why I've pulled out attack surface reduction, because the attack surface is growing, not quite exponentially, but it's growing really fast in a modern retailer. And then the cybercrime. If you look at actually most cybersecurity frameworks, they completely avoid talking about crime or fraud. which is a bit peculiar because there's a very close connection there. And more often than not, it's moving into cybersecurity to get that sorted out. It also, if you're a CISO or a group CISO, it also gives you an opportunity to clearly demonstrate the financial value you're bringing to the organization. For a retailer, you make a 1% reduction in fraud, it's probably going to be a decent number that's going to more than justify next year's budget, which in these economically stressed times is an important thing to think through. Last but by no means least, we're now on to retention. And I think this is where the CIISec framework actually delivers a true strength and accelerator. Once you've structured your roles and skills into that format, it's very, very easy to explain to your colleagues within cybersecurity how they're going to move from a level 1 to level 2 to level 3, or even migrate between the different units within cybersecurity. It then opens up the opportunity to bring in interns, which for me has been quite a successful way of trying to attract and retain cybersecurity talent, because there's some phenomenal numbers about how short we are on people, but the number of attacks is going up, availability of talent is going down, which then leads to high stress within your current teams or even burnout. And when I'm talking about this, I'm also thinking through a hybrid approach. So a hybrid approach is where you invest in the key parts of your organization that you want to own and control, and then you go to a managed security provider or a third party where you're comfortable to outsource almost the commodity aspects of that unit. Even when you adopt that hybrid approach, you will still be short of qualified, experienced talent when you're trying to keep up with the workload. And that's where the managing stress and burnout is a fundamental part of being a CISO now. It's almost 20% of your job is trying to make sure that you've got that in a well-organized, well-managed manner so that you can retain your staff and take it from there. So now, Izzy, hopefully you haven't fallen asleep during that, and we're on to the questions from the chat, which I cannot see. Is that okay?
Yeah, thanks, George. If anyone would like to put a question in the chat and I can read it out for George, yeah, then please go ahead.
And alternatively, if we don't have any questions, Izzy, could I hand it back to you?
Right, we've had one question through, George. I don't know if you can see it or if you'd like me to read it out.
Yeah, no, so thank you very much, Fatini, for your question. So we use a risk-based approach to prioritize. So we have the company objectives. We then have a list of risks for cybersecurity and technology. We agree them as a technology core leadership team. We actually present those to the corporate governance organization, and then we align our investments back into those risks, and each risk has a mitigation plan and owner. And then we're it's probably best to say we're rebooting how we do risk management at the moment, and we're back to doing it in quarterly cycles. So hopefully that answers your question. You've also, I guess, you've got to be capable of reacting to the occasional incident and to mitigate that. So the next question is, do you have any insights into the losses from cyber versus non-cyber incidents? Oh, yeah. So this is a great question related to what's it like versus what's cyber losses versus physical losses. The British Retail Consortium have some really interesting numbers. The things I've seen in the UK in the last 12 months is a dramatic jump in the physical losses at retailers, not specific to my current employer. And then some of the things that you might want to think about are the introduction of things like self-checkout, the lack of use of RFID for physical stock loss. In terms of numbers, a single cyber attack is worth way more to an organization than the physical stock loss at a retailer at this point in time. Normally because the cybersecurity incident will start in the millions. You have to steal a lot of product, unless you're Burberry or someone like that, maybe. But yeah. Thank you very much. Hopefully that was an okay answer. How do you set technical controls with so many different global standards? Thank you very much for the question, Tony. So yeah, we kind of actually take what is the strictest requirement we have and then apply that to everyone else on the basis that it is probably the best practice. We will only, and then we offer an exemption option for that, where it's all auditable and on a country basis or a divisional basis or a team basis. They can ask for an exemption to the strict requirement and give us the justification and then put it into monitoring. So yeah, as you say, start with the most strict and then offer exemptions. That's how we are approaching that one. And it's actually good learnings. So for example, we've learned a lot from some of the other regions and their standards. What is your take on planning and building the capacity and competence in terms of training and upskilling and how it can meet the cybersecurity skills and competence requirement? So the last two engagements I've had about building a cybersecurity capability, it's using that framework that I talked about, then bringing in the competent leaders, because without those competent leaders, it's going to nothing's going to mature or grow. In terms of thinking through capacity, that's where I go through each unit and I look for what can I pass to a professional third party now, and what do I need to control across GRC, security operations, security culture and competence. So if you go around that little circle that I had, you then very quickly identify where you need to establish a presence of your own full-time and employees, where you need to prioritize the headhunting of the first set of managers, and then how you work with your talent acquisition team, your HR team to bring in and staff up. The bit that I haven't maybe done as much as I would hope to is maybe apprenticeships, but they've been quite difficult to use in the UK for me. But the linking up with UCL and getting graduates out of, it was quite bizarre, it was out of the terrorism and cyber group. They were fantastic to bring in as interns because they had a much closer understanding of the criminal mindset. And it's easier to train cybersecurity into people who have that mindset than it is to give people that mindset. I might have gone off at a tangent on that one, but that's the best you're going to get on that one. Emerging attack vectors and the coming to short for retail operators, cyber. I can give you a fun one, which is Fraud GPT, which is an LLM, which is structured to do all the social engineering, not necessarily for a retailer, but it generates all the emails, social media messages. It even looks at the responses and gives you the replies. So your poor contact center and everyone else is now up against an LLM, which it's funny now. It might not be that funny once they start getting the success rate up. And then cyberbullying, yeah. So it's something that some companies don't deal with well, and they are almost dismissive of it. It's not something that I dismiss, and it's something that I prioritize. And we have a zero tolerance of cyberbullying, and I'd suggest that's where you want to be on that one. And you have to work really hard with your HR team to make sure you've got a well-defined acceptable usage policy that's enforceable across the countries in which you might operate, because again, you've got variances in what you can do on employment law. And then the burden of proof that's required to deal with this can vary quite a lot as well. So yeah, I hope that's been okay for everyone. Izzy, what do you think?
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you, George. So just quickly from me, a big thank you to George on behalf of CIISec for this fantastic masterclass. And thank you all for attending. There's some really great questions at the end there. And we'll be in touch shortly with details of the next masterclass. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much, everyone. Be safe. Bye-bye.